On municipal services as our focus area, August 28th, 2017, and it's 5:30. Could you please call roll?
Deputy Mayor Wells.
Here.
Councilmember Baggett.
Here.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
Here.
Councilmember Holman.
Here.
Councilmember Pelosa.
He's excused. He's in the emergency room over at our hospital.
Councilmember Trot Manuel.
Here.
Councilmember Wagner.
Wagner's called in and he's going to be about a half hour late. Okay. With that, are there any announcements, reports, or presentations?
No,
other
Chair.
than what we have here? Okay, thank you. Let's start with agenda items for council discussion. A, residential commercial development overview, a 30-minute presentation.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. For the record, my name is Jeff Tate. I'm the Assistant Director of Community Development, and to my left is Jason Crum. Jason's the city's Development Services Manager and Building Official. And to his left is Jeff Dixon, Planning Services Manager. So we're going to go through a few slides as part of a presentation on development review procedures for both residential and commercial. And really we're looking at this as hopefully a springboard into a series of presentations. What we've prepared is something that provides kind of a 30,000-foot overview. And really as we go through the slides, certainly feel free to ask questions as we're going through. But really at the end of the conversation, we're hoping that you'll provide a little bit more guidance as to how we bring any one of these processes that we talk about or processes that we don't talk about back to council so we can do a little bit deeper dive. How hard is it? Are you able to view the screen very easily? I can't tell the size of the, okay. Development in general, I mean, we could probably break all of our procedures and the projects that we work on down into 50 categories or so, from a subdivision to a sign permit, building a new house, building a new commercial structure, replacing a furnace in your home. All of there's a number of different types of procedures that are in place for reviewing different types of development proposals. The ones that we've selected to highlight this evening are the 5 categories that are bullet pointed on this slide. Residential construction, where it includes building a new home inside of a subdivision. Residential construction, where you're building a new home outside of a subdivision. The subdivision process itself, new commercial construction, and then tenant improvements. And also on this slide, we've shown a little bit of information about typical calendar review timeframes. And we've shown sort of the list of different types of disciplines that look at different types of projects. It's important when we're talking about timeframes, because as we jump into each of these 5 categories, we're gonna talk about how long it takes to get through a process. And it's important to kind of break things, I guess, into 2 different categories of what does the overall process take from the time someone first applies for something to the time that they're actually occupying or they're finished with that project. And then there's the time frames that it takes city staff to conduct a review. And most projects, the city staff doesn't conduct just one review. We'll conduct an initial review. We may have comments, and we provide those comments back to the customer. They prepare a response, and then it comes back in for a second review. So it's an iterative process that way. So we'll talk about those time frames and try to display those in general terms. You have projects that go faster and projects that go slower than some of the information you'll see on the upcoming slides. We'll jump into the 5 different categories and do a little bit of overview with each one of those. We're also going to talk a little bit about, once we get through those 5 different types of projects, we're going to talk about some customer service dilemmas that we frequently face. And when I say we, I think that it's we as a city, because we have different types of customers at different times. Sometimes there's the applicant that is in front of us right now, and then there's the future occupant that may inhabit a structure or occupy a commercial space down the road that we don't know about, but we really think of that as a customer as well. So Jeff, Jason, and I will go through those, the 5 different projects, and then we're going to come back to what we think are some of the customer service dilemmas that we face as well. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk a little bit about subdivisions. Oh, before I do that, I should also say we have some visual aids over here where we've laid out what all the city code books and standards are that are consulted with every project or many of the projects that we review. So those are building codes, city codes, engineering design standards, and then just some examples of kind of the volume of a submittal for the different types of projects that we review as well. And the point of this is really to show that a subdivision is a lot more complicated than looking at a tenant improvement at a commercial space that already exists. So as we talk about some of these, we may kind of point over in that direction as well, just so that there's a sense of volume in terms of what's being reviewed.
The first category of development processes that we want to talk about is a residential subdivision or platting. There are 2 types, and these are commonly known as long plats or formal subdivisions. And this is the type that the City Council might be most familiar with because prior to a city code change in June, these came before the City Council for ratification at the end of the review process. This ordinance change in June, Ordinance 6654, was as a result of some changes in state law, and it's a process and a change that increases the efficiency for this plat processing. The other type of platting that goes on is short plats. The long plats are divisions into 10 or more lots. The short plats, by contrast, are divisions into 9 or fewer lots. And these have always been administratively approved by the department director. The threshold for lot count for the short plats used to be 4, but was changed by City Council ordinance in 2014 to 9 lots. So 9 lots or less is the short plat, and 10 or more is the long plat. And while I'm talking about both of these processes, I'm really going to focus on the long plats because the processes are similar between the 2. The long plats account for the majority of single-family home construction that takes place in the city. In 2016, we had 8 applications for plats, and 2 so far this year, and that is just for the long plat related applications. I'm not including in that the short plats. As you've already heard, all of these applications are reviewed by many different departments concurrently, and you've heard a little bit about, and you can see on these slides, the overall processing time frame. What's not apparent is that the platting process really consists of 3 different sequential main steps and distinct applications to the city with each of these. The first, if you can look at the table in this slide, the first 2 rows are associated with the initial applications to the city for a preliminary plat and the environmental review or SEPA application. So these are reviewed by city staff, and there's a generalized time frame for the processing of those shown in this table, with the city's part shown in blue and the awaiting resubmittal by the applicant shown in yellow for a typical process. As you can see, this is to accomplish all 3 steps is typically a multi-year process. The purpose of the preliminary plat application is to allow a detailed review of the configuration of the proposed plat to ensure it's capable of meeting city standards. So this consists of evaluation of the specific lot configuration and road layout and utility arrangement in the particular subdivision.
Can we ask questions while you're doing yours?
Yeah, Councilmember Troutman.
Okay. You said the blue are for the applicant, right?
No, blue is with city.
Oh, city.
See,
okay.
they've got the key there on the left.
So when, in January, when they come to the city first, and then what do they have to do in February, March, and May, and June, September, and October?
Responses.
The applicant. What steps do they have to?
Let's see,
So what the graph is intending to show is that for the month of January, in this case, the city staff is reviewing. At the end of January, in theory, we provide a comment letter back to the applicant. And the applicant then spends, usually is about 2 months, preparing a response to the comments, redesigning the layout, adjusting for whatever comments the city staff would have made. So those orange or yellow areas depict that iterative process. When is it in the city's court and we're doing our review and they're waiting for us?
Okay.
And then when it's in orange, we're waiting for them to prepare something to resubmit.
Okay. Thank you.
and this is really a crucial step in the process because we're looking for it for purposes of meeting city standards, but it's the initial review, and there is subsequent later steps, but we've got to get the groundwork laid for it to be able to meet city standards in those subsequent steps. And
At
this,
what point in this process, or do you at all, when they bring in a large development like this, look to see if we're going to be able to handle the traffic and all the other things that are associated with something that might be that large?
this is, we conduct that kind of evaluation at this preliminary plat stage, either through the preliminary plat application or the associated SEPA application.
Okay, thank you.
And when that review is completed, and then it's scheduled for a properly noticed public hearing with the city's hearing examiner. The hearing examiner takes public testimony for the proposed plat, and after taking that testimony, issues a written decision based upon a staff recommendation. The second step, denoted by rows 3 through 5 of this chart, is the civil plan application process. With the hearing examiner's decision and the conditions that are attached, the applicant then brings in the civil plans to show us the construction level detail for the road network and the road construction, for the utilities, and for all the improvements they're making as part of that proposed plat. So this may be looking at pump stations, pressure reducing valves, signs, landscaping, parks or playgrounds that they're constructing, all of those elements. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, there's a process for commenting and then for the applicant to resubmit revised plans. And when those improvements the plans are satisfactory, then the applicant can proceed to the actual construction of all those roads and utilities. And once those improvements are constructed and they're satisfactory, inspected and accepted by the city, then the applicant can submit for the final plat. So that's the third step in this, and represented by row 6. Through the review at the final plat stage, the city assures that all conditions that were previously established are being met and the project is in conformance with all city standards. So this is a very crucial stage, and and it's also a crucial stage because the improvements like the utilities and the roads that were constructed by the private development are assumed become the responsibility of the city for ownership and maintenance. At approval then, these record drawings for this subdivision are recorded with the county for record keeping and taxation purposes.
Is there ever a time where a developer comes in and maybe has 175 houses and there is absolutely no way the roads can ever accommodate that you would say that that's too intense or too much for the capacity of the roads, and the roads are such that they can't be increased?
Either that's usually a problem with they may need to change their road network within their proposed subdivision to put it to different streets or rearrange it to address those concerns, or they may need to be responsible for off-site improvements. They may need to widen a roadway that's not of their ownership, or improve an intersection, or provide signalization elsewhere off-site.
Councilmember DeCoursey?
So, Jeff, on, let's see, 1, 2, 3. What is the fourth line again? I can't read that.
Civil.
Civil.
Civil submit.
Submittal.
That's
No,
the-
that's that's another submittal. Okay, so it's a preliminary submittal, and then that's your final submittal?
Well, they do, there's the SEPA and preliminary plat is the first step, then the civil plan review and submittal and then they proceed to construction of that, and there's inspection of that, and once that's all inspected and satisfactory, then they can proceed to the third step, which is the final plat submittal.
I just wasn't clear on what that particular
Sure.
step was. I couldn't read it. So thank you.
Councilmember Trout-Manuel?
So is this process, it looks like it takes 3 years. Is that for different size of construction, or is this for a large construction?
This is the long plats.
This is probably
Plat.
for a pretty typical plat, because you can see a significant period of the time is with the applicant for the actual construction of the improvements.
And some of what drives it too is season. So I mean, there's a period of time, a window during the year that the developers are seeking to do a lot of their work. And they're forced by weather to slow down during certain times of the year as well. So, you know, the two big orange strips that are in that graph are the civil design, because a lot of developers don't want to put a lot of energy into designing all of the roads and utilities and paying tens of thousands of dollars to a design engineer until they know they've got their preliminary plat approved. They can overlap, and sometimes it's a business decision that the developer will extend a little bit of risk and start that design process earlier. But really the design process for the civil and then the construction of the plat, you can see that those two together take up a year or maybe a little bit more than a year of that whole 3-year process.
And the left-hand side of this slide shows the regulations that the city looks at in the review of those proposals. And the right-hand side shows many of the applications and specific analysis that's submitted for the city's review. It's only after that final plat approval process and the recording of the document do they actually have the individual lots that they can begin the construction of the individual homes.
Councilmember DeCarcy?
So, Jeff, first of all, I mean, you look at all our codes and standards, and when I started in this business 200 years ago, we had a book about that thick. So things have definitely changed
Bigger
over
now?
the years. So I can remember back that far when it was kind of a pocket handbook to do all your subdivisions, your plats, and your vertical construction. Didn't we make some sort of revision, do some streamlining in the submittal process with this?
City Council's taken 2 actions in the last year that have helped streamline process timeframes. One, the most recent action that City Council took is to allow a final plat to be considered administratively. So when you see at the very end, the far right, I think from all of your positions, at the very end of that graph, and you see the tiny blue, the tiny orange, the tiny blue, and the tiny orange, a few months ago, we would have had to add about 3 more months of blues and oranges for council to take action. So there was that. The other action that council took probably 9 months ago, maybe it's a year ago, is to allow civil submittals to come in advance of the hearing examiner's preliminary plat decision. Again, so our city code actually forced the developer to wait until preliminary plat was approved by the hearing examiner. Now they can take a measured risk and do design work earlier and submit earlier if they so choose. Business decision at that point. But at least the code doesn't preclude it.
So now I'm going to talk about building a home within that subdivision. So the overall timeline from application submittal to final inspection and occupancy of that new home is about 6 months, 4.5 months or so that is in construction. City review time, typically for the first review is 2 weeks, and then second review is 1 week or so if needed. And so it's a relatively short time frame to get those homes constructed, but they really benefit from all of the detailed design and planning and review that went into the process that Jeff Dixon talked about with the subdivision and the civil submittals. So At the time the home builder is ready to come in and start building on all these lots, you've got your roads are constructed, your sidewalks are there, all of the utility infrastructure is in place and ready to connect to. The storm system has been designed to anticipate all the hard surface from that future home, the rooftops, the driveways, all of that. Driveway locations are set. So it's a relatively easy process for us and the home builder. I also wanted to mention, we also have a stock plan. So you can see this second one from the end is a typical single-family subdivision submittal, your building plan and your structural calculations. We have a stock plan program where all the developer has to do is come in with that. So they get their building, their stock plan buildings, if they're going to reuse a floor plan, a stock plan over and over throughout the subdivision, they could come in advance, have those 4 or 5 model homes reviewed up front and approved, ready to go. So instead of paying the $2,000 plan review fee for all of those lots in that subdivision, they just come in for a $150 review of the site plan for their review fees, so they get a benefit of a cost savings there. And then we're also able typically to turn around those individual lot reviews in about 3 days' time. So they could come in on a Monday, submit their application, and have a permit issued on Friday and ready to construct over the weekend. So that is a really beneficial program that we offer for those that want to take advantage of that, or a subdivision. But again, that's because all the complex planning and engineering and construction has already been done for those.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
So Jason, if there's a minor modification made to the stock plan, what does that entail for review by the city, or is it just something where they just note it on the plan and go from there?
Yeah, we can take, so there are some options, so they can come in with they'll come in with a left and right, different, maybe a garage, 2 garage, 3 garage. So we anticipate those options up front. If they're coming in with more of a major modification where the structural design has to be reevaluated, then we would do that kind of on a case-by-case basis and probably do another week or 2 review if they're going to modify that.
So if they made some minor interior wall location changes, that would be just a...
That would, yeah, and typically that could be done more as maybe a field change if that's something they're doing out in the field.
So if you had a stock plan and I moved a weight-bearing wall and you approved it, and then the subdivision is all accepted and I'm the resident and the house collapses on one side because of some design flaw, is the city responsible since they put their stamp of approval on the modification?
So it's the architect who makes that change, and the structural engineer takes responsibility for that design. So if they're going to make modifications to a structural element, we would be reviewing that and verifying that what they're proposing is going to meet the safety standards of the building code. So ultimately, liability, there's a lot of players involved. The contractor, depends on if it was constructed per the approved design or not. But generally, we're looking at whether the design presented to us meets the code, and if so, then we stamp that as approved for construction. Contractor then has the liability to make sure they construct it that way.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
They would have to show either calculations or design
Correct.
Yeah.
modifications, so when you're reviewing it, you have that backup data to do it, it's okay.
Right, absolutely.
Okay, great. Councilmember Trout-Manuel.
So no one actually goes to your home and checks to make sure that everything is
During construction?
before construction?
Yes.
Well, during construction, our building inspectors go out there several times. So they're out there at 8 to 15 different inspections throughout the construction of that home. And if council's interested, when we come back for a discussion of single-family residential, if you'd like, we could step through some of that inspection process.
In fact,
I think it's interesting, the new complex, I keep forgetting the name of them now, the 2 over by Fred Meyer, I know what they are, but anyway, it was interesting when you see the inspection process there. where like in the outside sheathing, there were marks in the outside sheathing, and some were spray painted okay to cover and that, so, you know, the inspection process was very evident on those buildings. I'm glad to see they're taking that level of initiative rather than just writing something on an inspection report.
And on those buildings, bigger buildings like that, or Trek, or the Promenade Apartments, so in a house, you may always go to a house and do a foundation inspection, and then a framing inspection. You really complete that inspection for the most part that day. You go to a building like that, and they're doing it in phases. So you're out there potentially, we are out there, our building inspector might be out there for 7 framing inspections. And because they're looking at it in pieces. And yeah, that spray paint's communicating between inspector and contractor and what's okay and what's not okay. So it helps control and identify what's been phased through and approved and what hasn't. And one other thing that I was going to mention just on the stock plan option too is, like Jason said, there are options that you can design into your stock plan. You can probably build the same house in about 6 to 8 different configurations, and you and I driving by it, you'd think they're all different houses, just the way they do a roof line and move it, or they switch left garage, right garage, and all these different, you can build, I mean, you can really make those houses look different and make it feel like a different, the same 8 houses, an 8-lot subdivision, you could have the same house built 8 times and it would look like 8 different houses. So it's an appealing option, I think, for a lot of contractors. Building a home outside of subdivision. Now, we only process about 6 to 12 of these types of homes a year. We don't do a lot of, most of the new single-family residences are built within subdivisions. This becomes one of our more complicated development projects. And I think a lot of times it's because there's a wider gulf between the applicant and the fact that they're probably doing this once in their life, and then the fact that there's a lot to do on this from a city perspective. Like in the subdivisions, like Jason was talking about, you don't have the utilities in place. You don't have the sidewalk and street lighting and that type of frontage infrastructure in place. So this becomes a labor intensive, I think, on both sides. Applicant and city to work through these projects. So when you look at the time frames, instead of being a 6-month process to get through from permit application to occupancy, it probably doubles. I think in some cases it may more than double. It may be 15 months to get through this and not just a year. Because, again, we spend more time in the review process because, quite frankly, the submittals that we receive, again, the customer who's packaging this up and giving it to us, it's the first time through it, so they may not have checked all, crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's, so we end up having a longer review time. Instead of 2 weeks, it probably takes us 4 weeks or so to get through the review, and we end up accounting for, an extra 1 or 2 reviews in the process to get through this. This image is an example of an infill lot. Someone wanted to build one home on it, but it's not part of a subdivision. When it's all said and done, you've got your streetscape in, sidewalks, the home is there. Access can be a challenge in these. Providing utilities can be a challenge. Pulling utilities, how close is the sewer and the water line to this lot because it's not been set up. That can be challenging. Sometimes those utilities are far away, so a septic system has to be installed, and now you're inviting in King County into the process and King County Public Health to review the septic systems. Again, a challenge every time we kick off one of those projects.
The next development process we'd like to talk about is the process for a commercial building permit for a new building. And this can be either for retail use or for an industrial use. This slide shows a site that probably should be familiar, as it's kitty corner from City Hall. So this is actually the Trek Apartments. And the process for a commercial building permit shares many similarities with the review steps for other building permit processes. The complexity and timing can vary by the characteristics of the site and by the surroundings. In the example here, this site was already had the original buildings removed. It had already been a graded and flat site. But what complicated this particular proposal was the poor soils that existed on the site. So as a result, they had to spend about 9 months building pilings into this site that then they could use for the support of this particular building. Then it took another 18 months for the construction of this 5-story building. An alternative to driving piles that's used oftentimes in the case of industrial buildings in the city is actually preloading sites where they bring in a pile of soil that they know is going to be of a certain weight, and they place it in advance on a piece of property in order to compress the underlying soils to prepare them for the support of a subsequent building. The TREC also had the advantage of having partial road improvements in place and stormwater in place with the Division Street improvements that the city had previously made. And in the case of the nearby Merrill Gardens apartments, that construction was complicated by the excavation necessary to construct a below-grade parking garage for that particular project. Commercial building permits can require SEPA if they're for larger commercial buildings or if they're involving a site with environmentally sensitive areas. And in the case of the particular TREC building, there was an additional land use approval that was necessary, and that was the design review decision by the city went on concurrently with the building permit, and that was in response to council's adoption many years ago of downtown design standards. Also, with the processing for commercial building permits, the applicant can choose to bring in the civil plans. There's some risk to doing so, but they can do that to compress the overall timing of their review and approval process with the city. After the civil improvements and building improvements are completed and they're inspected by the city and all satisfactory, then the city can actually issue certificates of occupancy for these projects. This slide again shows some of the city regulations that are involved in this review process, as well as some of the documents and applications that are submitted for the process.
Okay, and the last development type that we're going to overview here is a tenant improvement. So this is where we have an existing commercial structure in place, but a new tenant or a new owner wants to come in and make modifications to the building, maybe just support a new business. So these vary quite a bit from simple to quite complex. For most of the ones we see, typical review time from the city is 2 weeks, first review, and then a week for the second. And oftentimes that second review isn't necessary. But again, it really depends on the complexity of the project. So it could be as simple as cosmetic work, relocation of some interior walls, to structural changes, plumbing, mechanical, HVAC system, and at times a new tenant is proposing a business that was never anticipated when the building was originally constructed and permitted. So for this new occupancy type, there might need to be upgrades to the safety, life safety elements, fire suppression, egress, accessibility. So this one depicted here is pretty simple, represents a transition from one casual dining to another. So that one would be a simple one that would go through a quick review process. For an example of a more complex one under construction right now, we have the Dave & Buster's down at the Outlet Collection. So there we have a big retail mercantile space that's open, that now they're proposing an entertainment facility with food and beverage service. So that one required a lot of internal upgrades to kind of subdivide the areas, and then they've got a commercial kitchen now, so they have to provide some kitchen hood, fire suppression, upgrade to the HVAC system. So I think think they even relocated an entrance for egress. So that one was a much more complex, and I think city review time was about 7 weeks total, split up between 2.5 reviews or so, 2 full reviews, and then kind of a follow-up. So, but overall, not as complex as the commercial building permit.
What about, let's take this little restaurant here. Do they have to pay mitigation traffic mitigation fees or anything like that?
So there's usually a credit. So for this one, they're going from one restaurant to another. So there would be no additional trips generated. So there would be no traffic impact fee. Potentially at times though, if you're going from say an office space to a higher traffic use, I know sometimes we get it's really based on if the new proposal is adding more trips to the neighborhood system is when they're applied. So it's situational.
And there's a standard that we work off of. So there's a guide that basically says that a restaurant will generate X number of this size, will generate X number of trips, whereas like an office space will be a different number. So we look at that, and really what drives it is change in occupancy.
And that's a national standard. It's the Trip Generation Manual by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And so we have that as a guide, but we also offer for applicants who want to conduct their own traffic study to kind of demonstrate to us what the impact is going to be. We'll review that and take that into consideration as well.
This next slide just provides a summary of a lot of what we just talked about, but it gives you a breakdown of the average time that it takes to get through a process from application to approval for each of those, average review time that on our end as city staff, the number of people that are involved in different types of review, the hours, total number of hours that we spend in different projects, inspections, and then cost. So that I know that there's a wide array of cost up there, but the driver is really the scale of the project, how big it is. And on that cost point.
So yeah, the one on the right there, the picture on the right, is an example of one of our record permit transaction days from last year. That was a large commercial project that's under construction right now. That was a $3.6 million transaction for all of the permits and impact fees associated with that development. And there were, so many permits that you could see the receipt is on the floor there, and it's almost 3 cubicles in length. That's not typical. The one on the left is more typical, and represents a single-family residential permit at issuance. I think with 2017 fee schedule, typical single-family home is about $34,000, and I'll show you that breakdown here. So over 40% or so is the utility system development fees and permit fees for your water, sewer, and storm. That's the wedges in blue there. And then your impact fees are the ones in the kind of the green yellow. So that's your traffic, park, fire impact, and then your school impact fee. We have 4 different school districts within the city limits. So when those applications come in, based on the location, we determine which impact fees are going to apply, and then based on the proposed use. And then the gray wedges there represent the permit fees. So the plan check fees due upon submittal of the application, and those costs are applied towards our plan review. And then the permit fees are due upon issuance, and which are applied to our inspection costs.
Councilmember DeCoursey?
So if there's additional inspections that need to take place on a construction site, do we charge additional fees for over and above what we would anticipate that cost to be?
We do at times, so we do have that in our fee schedule for additional inspections. If we don't always apply it, but if our inspector is going out to the site routinely and a contractor is not prepared or ready for those inspections, we will tell them, you know, if we have to come out again and you're not prepared, then we're going to apply an additional fee. And I believe $63 is our hourly fee right now in the fee schedule.
Wow, that's cheaper than public health.
It's pretty.
It's very reasonable.
So we face, I think as a city, a number of customer service dilemmas that I'll walk through real quick here and just kind of highlight. So utility infrastructure. So we often are faced with a customer who is designing a project, looking at our plan, our design standards, or it's approved and it's a construction standard while they're in the field. And oftentimes I think we're faced with a question about deviation from those standards. And really the question about deviating from standards is thinking about short-term and long-term customer impacts. So if we're looking at a deviation from a utility design standard, what does that mean to the ratepayer later on down the road? And we want to make sure we're doing our best to try to review those standards and see through a construction process that is a good investment for ratepayers. So that's a customer service dilemma, because at times if the applicant or the developer is in front of us and we're hesitant or maybe even resistant to a change, sometimes we're thinking about the customer down the road and what the best approach is for the long-term customer, as much as we are thinking about the short-term customer. I'd say the same principle applies to building safety and first responders. Building is expensive, and putting in fire sprinkler systems and alarms and radio communication systems and things of that nature all cost a lot of money. So again, as we work with a developer who may be asking us, you know, can we do something a little different than what the code says, we are thinking about what does it mean when the occupants are in the building and their safety, and what does it mean when medics or fire or police show up to a building, and how are they in a safe and predictable scenario when they show up. Communication is a big one because first responders need to be able to communicate through radio coverage inside and outside a building in the event of an emergency, and radio communication systems can be costly. Maintenance down the road, that's something that we think about. We have M&O staff that maintain storm ponds and landscaping and lots of street infrastructure and utility infrastructure, so we have to be thinking about what makes sense and what's efficient from that service delivery of maintenance and operations. Flexing to say yes. We flex a lot to say yes. And at times we're thinking about, well, what's in the best interest of the city long term. Warehouses I put up there, sales tax generating uses, are examples of we're wired to try not to say no. But sometimes if you're taking a commercially zoned property that has a long-term benefit of maybe putting in a use that can generate sales tax, which is a strong, solid, sustainable revenue source over time, and someone wants to put a warehouse on that property, which may not be generating the same kind of long-term revenue, that's a customer service dilemma. How do you shepherd that customer through, or and help them and be customer service oriented to those folks, at the same time doing what's right in the best interest of the city? And then there's the other surrounding folks when there's a development activity. You know, people are interested when you live near a development proposal when it comes to stormwater impacts, traffic impacts, noise and lighting, things of that nature. So that's another customer that's out there. And then ensuring that a large or complex or a poor set of plans doesn't clog the system. And this does happen. I mean, a big project that comes in, you know, there's a lot of other people waiting in line to get their plans reviewed, and we're always trying to figure out ways that we can better tweak the way we're approaching plan review so that not everybody in the system is waiting for the big project that's going to take 8 weeks to review instead of the normal 4 weeks, or a poor set of plans. You know, there are times, and I'm sure that you've had a constituent at least one time approach you saying that I waited longer than I thought I'd have to wait for my plans to come back, and there were 300 comments. Because that does happen, and our response is that sometimes the set of plans that comes in isn't the highest quality. The standards and the codes are there to review and look at and prepare your plans against, but sometimes you get really high quality material that's submitted, sometimes you don't. And that can really shock the system when you get a poor set of plans and you have to spend a lot of time. Nobody who works in community development or engineering relishes the thought of writing a letter that has 300 comments in it. Takes 2 days to write the letter alone.
So here's some just some sample plan sheets. These next 4 images come from that plan set that's kind of sitting up on in there for a commercial project. And I know you can't read it, just wanted to kind of point out, these are just some examples of the type of sheets that are typically in a building plan set. So this sheet is just a list of the abbreviations and acronyms that are going to be found throughout that plan set. So it's close to 800 terms in there, so it's a lot to reference and keep track of at times. This sheet, the 2 tables on the left, this is just a door schedule. So this is just a list of all the different doors that are in this building, the width, the height, what kind of handle it has, the hardware, safety latching, fire rating, all that's in here and referenced, you know, several times throughout the plan views. Here is just a typical detail sheet. This one happens to be for the exterior walls, so a lot of specifications and references for how those walls are supposed to be constructed. Several detail sheets throughout the plan sets that are referenced back and forth. And wanted to mention, you know, these details are utilized throughout the entire life of the project and beyond. So initially by the architect and our plans examiners who look at it, make sure it's designed according to code, and then by the contractor now who's out in the field and it relies on these drawings to be correct, to order the right materials and fasteners, and then our inspectors, then they go out with the approved plan set, make sure now that it's been constructed properly per the design and the approved plans. And then in the future, so maybe 3 years from now, there's a new owner who wants to make changes or needs to determine, you know, how it was designed initially, so they'll rely on those plans. They're over in the city clerk's office, probably in the archive, to be used. So it's important to make sure that these plans, since they, you know, live on, are done correctly. This one, really hard to see, but just a note here that everywhere you see any kind of red writing, some notes, that is where one of the plans examiners has identified something that is either missing information, might have a reference in error, or just does not meet the building code. So you can see the amount of red marks on this page. The plans examiner, they went through that sheet and all these other sheets line by line just to verify that it meets code for the benefit of the architect, the owner, for us, and for the public, because, you know, we all have a reasonable expectation that when we enter this building that it's going to be safe and that it's going to meet the life safety standards of the code. So our review staff takes, you know, that very seriously and is very diligent and detail oriented when they go through these. This is an example of a civil plan set. So all the blue comments there are just comments by review staff. Could be traffic, planning, development, utilities, and as Jeff mentioned, you know, sometimes there are 300 comments. The customer service intent or goal for us is we're providing a detailed review of everything we get so that they know what they have to address to get it back into us for a second review and get it approved and under construction. Sometimes the applications are missing information, so we don't see some of these details until the second, third review, which unfortunately, extends the review time. But
Councilmember DeCoursey, now I want to remind you, we got the 3 J's up there.
I know.
You're not a J.
No.
Okay, go ahead.
Jeff and Jason.
Yeah,
Jason's
okay.
in the middle. So Jason, to me, this looks like an electronic submittal.
correct, yeah.
So do we allow electronic submittals for all plans or just certain ones now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We do not. We're in a transition phase, so right now, building plans and land use applications do not go through the same electronic review as does our civil plan. So, but as of this month, the civil review for FAC grading permits are 100% electronic during review. So we used to ask for 10 full-size paper copies of those applications a couple of years ago, and we kind of whittled down the number, and now we're at 0. So we estimate that in a year's time, that's 14,000 less plan sheets and printing costs that the developer needs to come in. And for us to route all that paper, that's going to reduce staff time of doing that work by probably 120 hours or so.
And
So-
storage along with it.
Yeah, exactly, storage, yeah.
Storage is
Yeah,
big,
shown
yeah,
over there.
yeah.
So, but we are transitioning to that. So that is our goal, to go electronic for all reviews that have kind of a site plan and for those that make sense.
The last dilemma, I think, and Jeff will speak to this and show a couple images, but really remains with undeveloped property and the complexity of what remains, and the fact that regulatory standards change over time and become more complex in many ways. A lot of the environmental and stormwater regulations have become more complex. And just talking about the difference between how that affects the ability of a customer to move through the development review process.
So in the preceding slides, you've heard a little bit about the customer service dilemmas. And there are some other factors that influence the development review process with the city, some of which are outside the city and the developer's or applicant's control. This can be such things as advanced planning. If an applicant contacts the city, schedules a pre-application conference where we can sit down with them, make sure they're aware of the standards that might apply, all the applications that might be necessary for their particular project, and kind of work with them to make sure that the process goes as smoothly as possible. Other things that applicants can do for advanced planning is we've got some processes where there can be some master planning for site development, where they can plan a phased development over time. In this particular slide, this is an area of the Lakeland community, and this is a site that has been planned for development for many years as part of the planned unit development approved for Lakeland. So development has been contemplated for here for a long time, and as you can see, it's this site is graded. It's been previously filled and leveled out. It contains a depression that is remnants of erosion control measures that were previously instituted for this site, and it's bordered by a fully improved public street. That street also includes utilities that have been brought to the site so that they're available to serve this subsequent development. And this specific proposal is for a convenience store, gas station, and car wash. And this application was reviewed in 4 months from the application submittal to the time of application issuance of that building permit. Other factors that are outside the city and the applicant's control that affects the complexity is the nature of the site and its surroundings. This slide shows a site that appears innocent enough, but what is not readily apparent is some of the factors that can complicate the development review process. These can include the presence of environmentally sensitive or critical areas such as landslide hazard areas, wetlands, or streams. In this particular example, you can see because of the topography lines on this site that this is a steeply sloped site, one that requires geotechnical evaluation to figure out how the development can support buildings or support the roadways to be built here. It may require technical evaluation to evaluate the grading necessary to create suitable sites for development and to make sure that roadways can achieve the city's maximum grade standards. We're also trying to look at having minimum grades for the purposes of emergency vehicle access like fire trucks and ambulances, and also for city maintenance equipment, the large Vector trucks that need to get up hillsides and stand in an appropriate slope to be able to service and maintain the utilities constructed as part of a subdivision proposal. And another factor on steeply sloped sites is to get minimal grades to address such things as icing and sanding for road maintenance over the winter time for public safety. This site illustrated here also lacks utilities proximate to it, and it also borders an unimproved public street. So those were things that this development would need to be responsible for that complicates that overall review process. In the next slide, I've also got a site that you can see looks fairly flat and is pretty open. It doesn't look like there's much to it, but what complicates this site development is that you can see by the city's inventory that this site is inventoried as containing a lot of wetlands, and it also has areas of floodplain on it. So what looks like it might be simple or straightforward oftentimes turns out to be more complex. Another factor that's outside the applicant's and the city's control is sometimes the other approvals that are necessary for projects. And oftentimes these are approvals that come from outside agencies that the applicant needs to be responsible for as in addition to securing the city approvals. This slide shows many of the agencies that we regularly work with, and these vary by the type of project that's proposed. Often these agencies have a different review process or review timing that needs to be coordinated by the applicant and with the city. And oftentimes these agencies also have different standards that apply. So that an applicant may need to meet the city standard and they may need to meet the other agency's standard. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers and the State Department of Ecology both have standards that apply to wetland mitigation construction, and those pay attention to different things than the city's regulations. They may not necessarily be incompatible, but they do have different authorities and different regulations that they're all trying to institute.
So that's the extent of the slides, and we're happy to share the slideshow with you. There's a lot of graphics in there and animation to make it not translate very well and providing it in advance. So it's easy to provide any of the information that you've seen. Like I said in the beginning, we're really looking for council guidance on where you'd like to go deeper or what we haven't covered. City Council makes policy for the city, sets policy for the city, regulations and processes, and as staff we implement. And I think that the more that we can communicate and kind of understand perspective, I think the better place we are in terms of how everybody supports that moving forward. So whatever council would like to hear more about, we're happy to build kind of a series of presentations. Happy to get feedback.
Councilmember Trout Manuel.
I would like to see some of those graphs, like how many months, there was 2 of them that you had, that it was the one with the length of time, and then also the circular one that showed the cost and stuff.
So we'll print out and put in everybody's box, and then can send out an email link too if you would like to access it electronically.
Councilmember DeCoursey.
Yes, as part of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, in a legislative process of looking at potential issues that may impact what cities are doing. At the last meeting, there was a question raised in looking at a process where if there's regulatory restrictions that are state imposed that are placed on the city, what are those? I mean, are they truly impacting what's happening in any type of development? So I guess I'd be curious to know if there's anything from your end that you see state regulatory wise that affects us as we go through this process. If that's occurring, what that might be, and what the possible recommendation for mitigation effects would be on that would be very helpful.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Councilmember Holman.
Well, this might be a good time for me to apologize to you, Jeff, and to your colleague, Kevin Snyder. I frequently have used the city of Houston, Texas, which has no zoning codes, as a cudgel sometimes to try and speed up the process a little bit here in Auburn. I still want to see things move as quickly as possible, but I think the tragedy that's unfolding before us in Houston gives pretty good background reason of why we do look at zoning and 3 years worth of review sometimes. It's a pretty good lesson.
Jeff, Jason, and Jeff, thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing from you again. Nice job. And I would say for Bill Pelosa that he would like a hard copy of that, please, in his box.
Everybody will get one.
Okay, thank you. If
And,
there are no objections, we're going to move to the Pioneer Cemetery Master Plan. We have a number of the presenters here ready to go. And if that's, is that okay with you, Daryl?
I'm hearing no objections.
Great, good. And then after this presentation, we'll take a little break.
Thank you. Right time.
Right above it.
Make it big picture, I don't
Yeah.
know. I think you need to go
Above that.
in the gray area, I think.
In the direction.
Aha. There we go. And Bob, if you would join us up here, you look like you're going to sit in the grandstands the whole time. But that's not going to happen since you are the paid consultant. Anyhow, we're really excited to bring to you this evening the Auburn Pioneer Cemetery Master Plan. And this was a result of a funding through King County via Floriculture after we became a historic landmark at the Pioneer Cemetery. And the city's had this under their control for 50 years or so. I'm not sure the exact date. I'm sure Patricia could tell you. But so we contracted with Bob Hoshida and Wanzer Architects and worked with them in a steering committee that we're going to get two of the members up here in a few minutes to kind of dog and pony this as well. It was great to have Kelvin Harada and Charles Nazahara on the committee representing the Buddhist community that's been so involved in this cemetery. And our goal is to take this site that is a little bit tired, doesn't have the curb appeal and the respect of the community that it deserves, and actually turn it into a place over the next few years. And this plan kind of outlines its history, how it got to where it is, and where we really want it to go. We'll be coming back in a month or so with hopefully a resolution of support from the council that we can start the funding process as we did at the Mary Olson Farm many years ago to go seek other people's money to make this happen. This goal isn't near as huge financially as that was, but one that's amiable nonetheless. So I'm going to turn these first few slides over to Patricia, and she can talk about the location, and we'll rattle our way through this.
All right, so I'm sure you've all been to the Pioneer Cemetery. It's right across from Fred Meyer's in the middle of downtown, and it's that little triangle there. And if you go to the next slide, that's it in 37, which is pretty interesting. In the middle of farmland with the river running kind of kitty corner across that image. So this is a very old cemetery. People were buried there in the 1800s. It became a city-owned cemetery in 1962. And before that, it had had many community groups that had managed and owned it. We nominated it as a city landmark and King County landmark, and it is now that, which opens up some funding possibilities for its preservation. So, moving to the next slide, you see the original plat, which is the light-colored drawing of how the cemetery was laid out, and that was from 1889, which is pretty early for here. And a lady named Grandma Fawcett had that property and lived next to it, and though she was an illiterate lady, she believed in school, and so her little log house got often used as the regional school. That's just a little aside. And she had a couple of children that were the first buried there. And as it was used, you see the brown image is that same plat, the annotated as people used the site. And one of the first other burials in it was a ancestor of Charles Natsuhara, who's joined us today, a maybe great aunt or something like that. And thus began the relationship with the White River Buddhist Temple and the people of our Japanese American community. And so Charles's, is this your grandfather, Charles? And grandmother, and your father? No, the aunt, okay. And I'm sure if we raised our hands, who shopped at Natsuhara's and went there? Yeah. Yes, so that's the Natsuhara, and I can remember when I first got my job 27 years ago that Charles's dad would come in and discuss with then Len Chapman, previous, which sort of pansy or marigold he should be starting by seed that he would then use both to decorate the planters here at City Hall and there. There was a very tight and work-oriented relationship with this between members of that family and the Japanese American community, so much so that even when people were sent off to internment, or you might call them concentration camps during World War II, his family, Charles's family, showed movies in camp and took donations and sent that money back so that they could assure that there were flowers on graves and that the lawn remained mowed. And I find that, can't forget that. That's very important in our history and why this is such a treasured site. So, next. It's a site with some very unique monuments, and one of them is a monument to the pioneers of slaughter, but by and large, they are ones that are significant to the Buddhist community and representative of those Japanese American people and Japanese immigrants that were buried there. And it is not a forgotten site. It is a site that is very relevant to its community and much used. And up until recently, members of the Buddhist temple and other family members who had loved ones buried there thought there was no more space for additional interments. And so that was a concern, and that was one of the driving factors that suggested some of the work that we've undertaken. So we have a grant through For Culture, and we hired an interesting company that does ground-penetrating radar. And the little short red hashes are graves. The rest of those are like pipes. It took Charles Natsuhara and I quite a while to work that out, working with their engineers. And then we did a great deal of research to try to understand which graves got moved up to Mountain View and which stayed here, thus what land might be empty. So we worked on that, and then we put together a steering committee, and I went around asking people in my profession and at the University of Washington who we might find that would be sensitive to these unique needs at this site that would help us craft a master plan, and they said that this gentleman would. And so we were able to get him to come down to Auburn and work with us, and this is Bob Hoshida, and he is our architect that has worked on this. So, Bob.
I grew up in Seattle, and we had family friends in the valley and would come to visit. And I remember when it looked like that second image, when it was farmland. And when we came back and got the call to come and look at it, I had to explain that we do a lot of work in historic preservation throughout the area, but we've never worked on a cemetery before. So it was a bit of a shock, and to come back and visit the site and see what has changed all around it. But this little gem is still there, it's still intact. It was very, very nice to see. We'll go through this really quickly. I'm not going to do the typical PowerPoint where I read everything on that because it's all in your documents. But we did develop a series of components for this study and went through it basically in the order that you see there on the screen. I think the main thing, we can go through it a little more carefully, but the main thing was the recommendation for how to accomplish the goals and the vision that we came up with for this site. And then we'll get into the very end, which is how do we fund that and how do we do that over time. We started by looking at the existing site, inventoried everything that's there, learned about the center portion of the site, which is the pioneer cemeteries and some of the monuments that are there. Along the east side, the rows of interment markers from the Japanese American community, and interesting to see the development of those, how they changed over time from the earliest ones. Unfortunately, the oldest ones, the original ones, which were the wooden ones, are no longer there. But the nice thing about a historic cemetery is to get a sense of its age, and the markers tell you that how they were installed over generations. So that was the main thing, and then also looking at the condition of the landscaping, the condition of this perimeter fencing, and the condition of the parking lot. Those are the main elements that give a hint of what the character of this place was and what it should be.
I want to invite Kelvin and Charles up to speak to the condition of the markers and how that's important to the community that's served there, because we really tasked them with meeting with the Buddhist community to talk about how to do that. I had no clue, but yeah, just come on up and kind of these next two slides really look to the work of our steering committee. Grab a seat. Kelvin.
So if you were at the cemetery, you would see large blocks of monuments with these two gentlemen's names on them. So they have...
our last name, not our first name.
Just the hyphens?
That's a good clarification.
Calvin's getting a little sensitive here.
So they have a lot of a relationship with this place.
Okay.
So, I mean, part of the story, I guess, is in terms of, and this goes back to my grandfather, when the eastern portion of the cemetery the permission was given for the White River Temple to start burials there, that he organized the improvements. Part of that was what he saw was that there were, at that time, wooden markers that were deteriorating or being lost, and so, you know, in terms of his improvements and what you see there in terms of on the left side markers is that he organized the making of these concrete. When you go there, you see all these uniform concrete markers that were made. I guess I think part of the importance, or in terms of when I look at these, is that it brings back the effort that was made, the importance of trying to preserve. What he saw was the loss of markers, the original wooden markers, and that there was this need to to try to preserve them. I don't think he envisioned that that his work at that time was going to still be as important in terms of a historical aspect as we see today, or as it is today. But that was, that first image that you see on these in the terms of the PowerPoint are those original concrete markers that were made.
So one of our goals is to create an interpretive method to tell the story of what these ones are that have decayed, and didn't really know whether you should stop the decaying process. Is the decaying part of the process of a cemetery? So these gentlemen have been real influential in helping drive that care and maintenance story.
So what is the answer to that question?
The concrete is, by its very nature, porous, so that it biological materials and moisture and things get into it, and it's eroding the surface. I think the way those were made originally, it looks like they were cast and just regular cement, and
Etched.
a sharp knife or some sort of tool. The kanji, the characters were just inscribed, and they're very nice, but they are eroding. All those edges are eroding. Since they are historic, we want to preserve them, but we still want to be able to know what they say. A lot of them are illegible now. And so the idea is to clean them and put a sealer on them to slow down the decay.
Yeah.
And then one idea is to create a cast or metal plaque with that information maybe at its base, so that it doesn't detract from the overall, but you can still read those. That's our goal.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you.
From the standpoint of kind of looking at the unique, I guess, gift or the beauty of the site in itself, part of it is not only to transcend that kind of historical perspective of time, but also to be able to preserve and locate areas for existing family members. And I'm representing the 4th and 5th generation, myself and my children. My great-grandparents are buried there. My parents will be buried, or my grandparents are there. My parents will be there. So will I and my children, I think. And to be able to tell a unique story is a really a gift within the city itself. As you were talking about, planning and zoning, what the future holds, how to be able to tie that connection within the history in itself, and you have this unique, really, and I think that's the gift of the historical preservation, the designation, to be able to tell a story within the community and have a place to be able to do that. Is really a gift. And so that's one of the key points of how do you connect the past, the present, and the future. And I think those are Buddhist principles in itself, but they are really things that that human interaction is key of how the city of Auburn and its citizens came to be, as it, it's intertwined or interwoven with the Japanese community.
Councilmember Trotman.
So on this picture here, it shows little red marks. What are these little red marks? Are those are these people that are already?
They're already there.
Okay, so you said you would like to be added to that. So is there room there for your family and for yourself and your family?
Luckily, through the ground penetrating radar work, and then working with Craig and others, we found particular areas that interments could happen, and so that'd be part of the process of not only would it be preserving the past and the present, but being able to create some space for the future. And we know that ultimately, as families continue to grow, families will tend to shrink. And so there will be, less and less in their midst, but nonetheless, to have some space for those family members that wanted to be part with their ancestors.
So you have to be a direct descendant of somebody buried there to be buried there. Right. So Kelvin worked on trying to figure out how many generations and how many people are left. So that's got us to the 35 unused plots. Craig does 1 to 2 services a year there. And so that's where it came to a capacity issue and et cetera. And I think everybody's comfortable with where we're at, as well as discussion about could there be some special circumstances where somebody, maybe not through the White River or the Seattle Buddhist or the Tacoma Buddhist Temple, wanted to be buried there. Could there be a special circumstance made with the okay of the community that that controls? Yeah. So it was a great group. We have a couple more slides, but first I want to thank these 2 citizens that came out of gave time for some meetings, Memorial Day, celebrate other things, to talk to the community, to be the ears of our department. And it's really been helpful because this was a little out of my bandwidth, but it was really cool. So we'll go through the last few with Bob. Thanks, you guys.
Thank
Now, any questions of Charles or Kelvin?
Yeah.
They know their stuff.
I think getting to your point, one of the key issues is if there is space or area available that you can say will not be used for burials and ever in the future, if there's excess space, then how can we take advantage of that area? Can it become a gathering area? Can it become pathways? Can it become places for other relaxing or other uses? And that was a big goal, so that the future, we're not envisioning at some point it will be full.
So that was what kind of led to page 15 of the master plan, was what's on the screen here, is how do we balance out it being a amenity where the public can just go and enjoy, as well as a place where we know that we have capacity for the need. And that's what really led Bob in the master planning process. And that's what we're hoping to play off of through your approval in subsequent weeks as to what we want to bring forward. Obviously, there has to be some agreements made with the Sport Marine neighborhood company next door, because there's some joint parking agreements we have to work our way through. But we think that this project has some really good opportunities. The total cost is in the neighborhood of $156,000 to do all the type of improvements that we think would really be beneficial. And Patricia has some ideas on where we're going to go find that money.
1 second, I think Councilmember Baggett has a question.
Well, you touched on it, Daryl, and I was concerned about certain seasonal things going on over there with the parking of all those boats that are under repair or servicing by the facility across the street. We working out a plan with them to mitigate that?
That'll be a next step. We've been working with Dan Hyde on how the agreement or lack of agreement got in place in the first place, and how we can then approach them with some kind of mutually agreeable outcome that benefits both the cemetery on a day-to-day operation, but especially on the days where we know we're going to have a larger number out there, so that hopefully we can be fair to the business and fair to the cemetery with a property that's basically right away.
I thought that for the most part that property belonged to them.
No, it belongs to the city.
And, and I have kind of a concern about that, because the way the informal way that it's handled now doesn't properly frame the mentality that we should have. And I think that this needs to be framed, and we framed it on the west side, with the beautiful fence that we do take good care of. We've modified the trees a lot. But on the east side,
Yeah, and that's
that's
probably goal 1, is to make sure that the current agreement is not current anymore. It hasn't been in place for many years, and there needs to be a reconversation with, if reconversation's a word, I don't know, but there has to be another conversation with them.
Yeah.
Because I think we all have a common goal.
And I think that, I hope that you are intending on paving, or is it just going to be just gravel again?
Not for sure. It's going to, depending on the price, it'll be probably a mix of either impervious, pervious, and some crushed and some regular, depending on how we can reach an agreement.
landscape.
Because I think
Of the landscape.
that landscaping and how we do the different textures will also remind people of what some of the boundaries are, and there might be some areas where there could be some
We definitely,
use.
our goal is to get to some ADA parking along the fence line that's clear, it's discernible, probably moving the entrance a little bit so it's not right in the middle, but more in a more featured area a little bit to the south. And then working on limiting the number of boats and wind and how they access across that road. It's kind of dangerous, and working that all out.
Okay,
But
great.
we also understand that the Sport and Marine doesn't have another place as well.
And they're a
So,
valuable business.
Yeah, so
Yeah. You can do
the
this.
plan isn't part of this. I think what we're going to be looking for is that you agree in full that we want to make the cemetery better, and we got to go ahead to go find more money. which usually
The other
isn't
thing
always-
that I really like is I really like having a little bit of presentation here, so that the only presentation it really for most people is here, and then I like this little thing right here.
It's very
Kind of
important.
wraps it around and makes it into a warm place. Okay.
That's all. We'll be
Thank you.
back in probably 4 weeks with the resolution, hopefully for support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are now going to take a break for about 9 minutes. We will start at 5 after 7.